Welcome everyone to Voices with Vervaeke. I'm joined by and with my good friend Jonathan Pajot, whose work on the symbolic world deeply resonates with a lot of what I've been doing work on, and as many of you no doubt know, and I find Jonathan brilliantly insightful, and his reflections on the symbolic aspects of existence and his ability to reshine and refurbish these stories so that they can shine for us again is often, it sort of catches you. It's deeply impressive. So thank you, Jonathan, for coming.
Oh, it's my pleasure. I always enjoy talking with you. Ever since I discovered your work and kind of discovered the language which you're developing also to talk about these subjects, it's been really helpful to me. I find myself thinking in the categories that you are bringing forth, and especially speaking to kind of a secular audience, or also convincing Christians that the words they use have meaning, because sometimes we have this kind of internal language and it stops to actually be meaningful in the world, and it just becomes like a kind of magical language. So I've been using your expressions on attention, the idea of relevant realization. All of these expressions have been good to help people re-see things in a different frame so that they understand them. So I really appreciate our discussions, for sure.
Well, thank you for saying that, Jonathan. I aspire to this being true, that above and beyond trying to, convince or persuade people about my specific claims, truth claims, theoretical claims, proposals, practical endeavors, etc. I aspire that I do afford a vocabulary and a grammar for people that helps them to clarify and develop their thinking. I mean, that's that for me. That's the way in which I try to enact the Socratic ideal of being the midwife, right? The midwife for other people. So thank you for saying that. That means a lot to me. So what I wanted to start off specifically talking about, you released two excellent videos, and I'll put the links to them in the description of this video. One was on, I won't get the actual verbatim name.
Yeah.
One was on sort of the religious nature of a lot of the demonstrations that are happening around, that were sort of galvanized into existence by the death of George Floyd. And then you did a follow-up. They were sort of like part one and part two. One on the iconoclasm, the destruction of images, the pulling down of statues. And one of the things you did was you put your finger on a huge important aspect of this that is being completely ignored in the mainstream media, but I think is of vital importance. As has happened in the past between you and I very convergent. I was coming to very similar concerns and reflections. And I'd said some things early on about how COVID was going to accelerate the meaning crisis and cause just a mental health tsunami. And you'd see, a proliferation of conspiracy theory thinking. You'd see purity code behavior. Human beings are going to respond in, a fashion to this invisible, ubiquitous threat that's causing them to isolate. And I liked your invocation of the symbolic idea of fasting for most of their connections. And then I saw all of that. And then when the protests began, I had a reaction that made me sort of recuse myself from commenting on that publicly. Part of it was a concern that, which you said in your first video, of just, saying something that would be premature, polarizing. It was difficult to say anything that was going to be heard that had any kind of nuance or reflection to it. So part of it was just that kind of caution. But there was a deeper issue for me. I was very concerned, and I talked to my close friend about this, that I would fall into a kind of self-deceptive bias when I tried to talk about any of this. So give me a moment, please. I don't mean to trespass on your patience, but I want to, in order to try and articulate this, and this has helped me upon reflection, I want to invoke Weber's distinction between the manifest and the latent function. So to give you a classic example, Weber talked about the manifest function of the bureaucracy is to facilitate information traveling upward and decisions traveling downward, and that's its manifest function. But it has all kinds of latent functions. It has the latent function of allowing people to diffuse responsibility and shift blame onto others. And Kafka, of course, brought this into high art. He showed us how the latent function can, put us into a tragic situation, because our commitment to the manifest function binds us in a tragic fashion to the latent function that can be antithetical to it in kind of a profound way. And so I'm watching this, and I'm saying, well, yeah, that's horrible, and racism is a horrible thing, and what we're seeing happening here. And there's definitely, I know this because what's happened since 9/11 and the Patriot Act. There's been the militarization of the police, and that has been a very dangerous thing, right? And I know there's nasty tricks happening. There's voter suppression happening, and all kinds of bad things, right? And people are feeling, I think, legitimately manipulated and disenfranchised in powerful ways. And this is meshing in ways that we're all finding it hard to understand, with a history that has disadvantaged certain groups of people. And all of this is going on, and I'm saying, yes, these are issues that all get addressed. So I don't mean to sound Freudian here, but my sort of conscious, explicit awareness is going, yes, 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 but I'm having this negative, visceral reaction to all of this. And I'm trying to go, what's going on? And at first and I'm making all these things, and I can feel like I'm in the grip of something. And so I'm talking about this with my friends, and I'm reflecting on it, and I'm journaling about it and everything. And I'm coming to realize, and Jonathan, you know that I respect your allegiance to Christianity. I'm speaking about me here, okay? So I said, I'm back in my fundamentalist church, and I'm the 10-year-old again, and I'm being traumatized by a puritanical form of Protestantism. I'm being told that I have an original sin, that not because of any act that I committed, but that is just because of how I was born, and that there's an aspect of this that is unforgivable, no matter what I do. And everything I try to do to overcome this just makes it that much worse. And that I need to be absolutely contrite and guilty until some external, obscure authority will finally pronounce me, saved or whatever, and then what this brings with it, is bonfires. And I mean, I'm not being hyperbolic, Jonathan. I'm talking about gathering behind the church and putting the rock and roll albums and the books into a thing and lighting it on fire. Like, can you imagine?
Oh, right? Yeah, I've been through that too. I grew up with that kind of stuff as well.
Okay, so and so I'm realizing that the latent functionality of this is so reminiscent of a kind of puritanical fundamentalist Protestantism, and again, I was noticing the same things you're noticing. The acts of contrition, the throwing down of the stones in the high places, like from the Old Testament, right, where the prophets are always doing that, right? The kneeling and the confessions, and the statement that there's nothing I can do about it other than feel guilty. I was noticing how this was tremendously religious, and that, as I've said to others, that upbringing traumatized me. I mean, I remember going to the minister in the church with my mother because I read the Bible regularly, daily, and I came across the passage in the New Testament about the unforgivable sin. I fell into, I mean, Cartesian skepticism was nothing compared to the well I fell into about, well, how do I know what it is? And how, did I just do it? And if it's unforgivable, I'm now doomed. I'm doomed, right? And that feeling of being doomed and trapped, and I went to him, and what I wanted was a clear definition of what it was, and I just got the usual, you need to have faith, and it was very unhelpful. And so I was realizing, oh, John, you better keep your mouth closed because even if you want to speak about this is just going to come flowing through you. because, and it's good, and you're gonna, because you have an incredible bias. It's very hard for you to see this in a positive light, even though sort of intellectually you can understand these important things that we've already mentioned. You know, the racist history, you know, the subversive disenfranchisement of people, right? The militarization of the police. All of these things are real and they need to be addressed. But I realized if I try to say anything about this, my chances of speaking in a way that I think is clear were like going to be seriously undermined. So I just sort of held back. But then I saw your videos, and I thought, well, maybe with Jonathan's help, I can talk about this. Sorry, I don't intend this to be a therapy session. That's not what's going on here. I want to be really open with you about where I'm coming from, and I think your video actually points out that this tension. Well, I might be too bold. It suggested to me that this tension that I'm finding in myself is not exclusive to me. That I sensed in you, not to the degree I'm talking about, but also a tension between, you know, what this might be sort of at a manifest level, and then this unacknowledged latent function of religiousness. And then you have some criticisms, at least implicit of this, you had towards the end. You warned of danger in the first video because the religion that does not know that it's a religion is not oriented towards the ultimate, and sort of there's like a critique coming or similar to what Tillich would meant. It's ultimately an idolatrous, for all of its bringing down of images, it's ultimately an idolatrous religion. And then I was thinking about this, and I was thinking about how you know, that politics has in many ways taken over the domain of religion. I don't think it's drenched the 20th century in blood. But I know that, well, there's sort of two, because religions are supposed to have, like you said, there's supposed to be moments of communitas and transformation. And I'm trying to think, well, what are the only rituals left to politics? Well, there seem to be two. And it was noted how they seem to split between the right and the left. There's the demonstration or the protest or the rally. And the right likes the rally and the left likes the demonstration, the protest. Yeah. And then I'm thinking, and both of these, we have good historical evidence, don't bring about the new man, the new person, the transformation of human beings. And, you know, and all of the revolutions, left and right, the French Revolution, etc., onward, show that it doesn't bring about that. Although there is often a religious goal within the French Revolution, and, you know, they were worshiping the goddess of reason and all that stuff, right? It doesn't actually bring about the promised transformation that it is groping towards. And so I was thinking that, is it possible to talk about this sort of in terms that are kind of metapolitical about the latent functionality of the religion, and at that level legitimately criticize it without thereby implying that we think, or I'll speak on my behalf, not yours, without thereby implying that I think that we shouldn't do something about militarization of the police, the subversive suppression of voting and disenfranchisement of people, and then how that has often allied itself with historical factors that are ongoing of racism, etc. That's what I'm proposing to you. Is it possible? And I'd like to try and explore that with you. But yeah, that's sort of the frame I want to set out.
Yeah, I think for sure I think there are a lot of things to deal with in what you said, a lot of things to kind of unpack at different levels. I think maybe we can kind of separate them in different parts so that we don't get completely jumbled. One is to look at the possible reinterpretation of your experience, let's say, or the notion of the original sin, then the idea of Adam or the fall of Adam, what that can mean, and how we can reinterpret that in a manner which is more useful than your traumatized youth. And I understand, because I went through all the stuff you dealt with. I went through the same, and even the description of like the idea of blaspheming the Holy Spirit, and everybody wondering like, did I blaspheme the Holy Spirit? You know, all of that I understand, but I think there are ways to reappropriate those stories. And I say reappropriate is, I also believe one of the reasons why I went towards Orthodoxy is because they have a different vision of the fall of Adam, one which I think it has a healthier balance. So that's one. And then the other is then looking also at the way in which these protests or COVID and the protests together kind of just exploded into a kind of weird catharsis, and what that means and what it's kind of looking towards. And so sadly, the third part, which would be like how to get out of this, that kind of this bind that we're in, is the one which I don't know. Like a lot of people ask me, so what should we do? And I'm looking around and I think, I don't know what to do, except I don't know what to do socially. Like, I think I know what to do personally, but I don't think I know what the societal solution is. So maybe that one will be harder.
Well, but I do want to talk about that, because I've been talking about that with other people as well. So, but I'm happy with your proposal. But like I said, I'd like to put it, like I said, into the way in which what's happening, it has, at the level of the latent functions, well, you said it, I want to use your words. There's something dangerous happening in this as well. And I want to explicate and draw that out. I'm happy to hear your revisions. And so, I don't know what to call it. Let's say revisioning rather than revision.
Yeah.
Of these stories, and then, but if you could put that into dialogue with, because, okay, well, let me instead of making a statement, let me ask a question. It's kind of a request. I see in, I see an analog to a strong analog in this movement to that version of original sin that I was brought up with. Yeah. And let's remember that the word Protestant means those who protest. I mean, right there, and I was brought up in a church where, protesting and constantly declaring what was evil and what should be burnt, or, and that was daily, the kind of practice. So do you think that I'm incorrect in saying that the version of original sin, whether or not it's the right version, I'm going to give you space to talk about that, but do you think that maybe overly Augustinian version of original sin is what's at play in this movement right now? Am I incorrect about that?
No, I think you're definitely right. I think it's something that we've seen before, in the sense that maybe an inverted version of what we've seen before in terms of like racialized vision of the world in the past, which is that we've taken the notion of original sin and we've brought it down into biology, which is the scariest thing that can happen, because it actually is inevitable. Like, it actually does become inevitable because it's related, it's linked not in a really scientific way at all, but in a mythological way. It's still brought into a term which is using language of kind of biological identity or categories which are material categories. And so the idea of this racialized guilt, or was there in kind of 17th century racism, like kind of neo-Darwinism, kind of social Darwinist racism, this idea that certain races were inferior by their own biology and therefore were made to be slaves or were made to be the lower. And now we're seeing a kind of weird reversal of that, where we're saying to be a certain race is in itself to be the oppressor. Like, to be white is to be guilty of the sin of the revolutionary thinking. Like, it's kind of like, it's not completely original sin. It's like the end of the revolutionary trend in thinking, right? The French Revolution, the Marxist revolutions, and now we've come to kind of the end of it, where we're actually bringing it into almost a biological reality, where the guilt of the oppressor is a racial guilt. And so like you said, it does relate to original sin, because it means that as someone who has that identity, whether it's actually legitimate scientifically or not, it doesn't matter. They're still framed in those categories. As someone who has that identity, I have no way out. Like, I have no way out except for two things, which people are doing, which is to self-flagellate and to scapegoat. That is to put myself on the side of, find someone guiltier than me. And yell at him and tell him that he has to be canceled and he has to be excluded from society. It's the only two solutions.
Yeah, and that I like I said, I went through periods where the church I was in would be riven to bits by exactly that process repeatedly in cycles, again and again and again. And when I sort of woke up to that, I was like, whoa, this is when I started reading some literature, and I realized, the literature like showed me what human beings could be other than this. That was like, so.
But you're right in the Protestant sense. Like if you think of Protestant sects and you notice both the Puritanist kind of self-flagellation of complete depravity, and then the schismatic notion that all of a sudden the group I'm in is not pure enough. They're not close enough to the truth. They're not, and then removing myself with a smaller group, and then condemning those on the outside as being, as it's like an acceleration. It's always been there. It's there in every structure. Like we can talk about that, but there's an acceleration of it in the kind of fragmentation of Protestantism. And we see it in intersectionality to an extent which becomes completely absurd, where, you know, at some point it's so obscure that most like regular people don't even know what you're talking about, when trans exclusive this and then trans inclusive, and most people are like, I don't understand. And then there's smaller and smaller identities which are excommunicating other identities, and you don't know what's going on.
Yeah. So, I mean, that, to my mind, that is the meaning crisis on steroids or methamphetamine or something.
That's right.
So what, and I think given the deeply deleterious effects, which we're seeing, you and I were talking just before we hit the record about, you know, we're seeing, you know, people are like, they're people that were normally sort of very sane, like in our personal relationships, are moving more towards the fringe, and they're filled with anxiety, and they're describing their experience as surreal. I think, you know, the deleterious effects of the meaning crisis are being exacerbated by COVID, and then perhaps by certain latent aspects of this. But I wanted to give you the opportunity to make good on your promise that there's an alternative way. There's an alternative way, and I'm interested in this both philosophically and personally. I typically try not to get too personal in these conversations, but this one has to be different for the reasons I've already articulated, and I'm putting my trust in you about this. So that there's an alternative way of conceiving of the myth of original sin, and you know I use that word not in a pejorative fashion, and so what is that alternative understanding to your mind?
So the way to understand it is to clearly differentiate between sin and death. They're related, but they're different. And so in scripture, it says the wages of sin is death, right? And there's an idea that even in the scripture, it never says that we inherit the sin of Adam. It says that we, because of Adam's sin, we are in death. Like we are we are living in a world of death. And that's really the best way to understand it, which is that sin causes death. So you have a purpose, you miss the mark, and that's what death is. And so there's a brokenness. The system breaks down as you miss the mark. And this happens at every level of reality, whether it's in your own life or in society or entirety of the world. When something misses the mark, then there's a breakdown which happens. Now, we inherit the breakdown of that which is before us, right? We inherit death. So we are born in families that have missed the mark. We are born of parents that have missed the mark. We are born of systems that have missed the mark. And so because of that, we live in a world which has an aspect of it which is broken. We still have the aspiration of hitting the mark. And that's what kind of guides us and makes us want to live. But we have to live with the consequences of that miss. And the difficulty is that when you're in a world of death, that is when you inherit the consequence of sin. So when your parents miss the mark, and they will, and we know they do, you inherit that, and it makes it more difficult for you to hit the mark because you have all the baggage which comes, and you have inherited the patterns of being that will make that worse, right? Which will increase the brokenness, which will tend to fragment. Okay. And so that's the manner in which we need to understand original sin. that's what it is. It's the inheritance of brokenness.
So that, and I hope you take this as a helpful thing. That to me reminds me of, um, um, certain interpretations of the Buddhist notion of karma, that there are these patterns at work, and we inherit them, and they affect our behavior, and they cause suffering. And the way I've sort of understood this, at least psychologically and existentially, is, as you said, we pick up from others, our parents, our friends, and our culture. We pick up, and that, here's where historical racism does matter, right? We pick up patterns that are shaping us and moving us in ways that are detrimental to our aspirations. Is that a fair?
Yeah, exactly.
comparison? Yeah.
But the idea is, of course, the very desire, the very aspiration, that is the very possibility we have of conceiving the good and of seeing the point that we're aiming at, right? Of seeing it in our view and moving towards it, right? Is the very, how can I say this? Is the reminder that we are not, that we don't fit in this broken world, that we find dissatisfaction in the brokenness.
Yes,
so that's what causes our suffering, but it's also what can ultimately cause our hope, because we can see that we're not made, like there's something in us which wants more than this brokenness and this world of death. There's something in us which can see that which we can aim towards, and which is the good, of course. And so that is really let's say what Christianity shows us, and like what Christ shows us, is that the manner to reach the aim in the brokenness is, to a certain extent, embrace death. And that's really that's the hardest thing, is to embrace death consciously, embrace the brokenness consciously, and therefore we don't become slaves of that brokenness, right? It's to see your sins, to see the place where you missed the mark, instead of just blaming your parents, because that's what you will want to do, right? You want to blame your parents, you want to blame the system, and you're right to, because the system is broken. Your parents are broken. There's an aspect of everything that's given to you which is broken, not fully, but there is an aspect of it which is broken. And the solution is to actually rather see your own death, the places in you that you're dead, and recapture the vision, right? Recapture the aim.
So this brings me to a central question that I have about this. Thank you for that. I think that was very helpful. So let's shift the discussion onto mortality then. And the interesting thing, of course, and you're aware of this, I know, in the Greek world, is mortality has, and Heidegger developed this a lot, it has a much more encompassing notion to it. And then that'll help lead me to my question to you. Because one of the great sins, and I think this is the right word, in the Greek world, is hubris, right? Which is to, in some sense, forget your mortality, right? Right, and to think that you can, that you can be a god. And and this is captured in great literature. Conrad's Heart of Darkness, which of course is now a contentious work, but nevertheless, Kurtz's big sin is hubris, right? He forgets. And Marlowe's heroism is he commits himself to his humanity, that he will preserve his mortality. And I've been talking to my son about this because, he lives with me now, partially because of COVID, and I've been exposing him to certain ideas, and he's going, but I want certainty. And I'm saying, well, yeah, but you can't. Part of what embracing your mortality is to realize that no matter how good your idea might be, you're ultimately a fallible human being, you're finite. And he was going, but I don't like this. And I said, but your mortality isn't just, right? And you'll see how this connects to what you said in a sec. Your mortality isn't the fact, like in Tolstoy's Ivan Ilyich. Ivan Ilyich knew he was going to die, right? It's not that. Your mortality is that, like you said, in some fundamental way, we are finite, we are broken, we are not gods. So, and I'm seeing this in my discussion with him. How do you, because I'm trying to work this with him as a father, getting people to embrace their mortality is good because it prevents inflation, it prevents hubris, it prevents, I suppose it would prevent blasphemy too, from a Christian perspective. And as you said, it helps people to not to fall into the error of, by criticizing others, I implicitly remove myself from that criticism, right? I see all of that. How do we do that without traumatizing them? Sorry, that was a bit of a garden path.
I think there has to be. I'm sorry that I'm going to say this, but I think that trauma is part of the experience. Like, I think that death is traumatic.
But we don't want to be cruel, is what I'm saying. No, right.
No, I understand, but death is traumatic. Like there is a trauma in death, and so we need, like, the church fathers and the ascetics, they always say two things. They say, remember God and remember death. Right? Those are the two things you need to remember. I always kind of joke around and say, that's the Christian version of mindfulness. It's like, remember God, remember death, right? Yeah. And so the idea is that if you kind of remain in your death, then, like you said, you avoid all the problems that you talked about. And the strange paradox in Christianity is that by doing that, you actually do become God.
Yes.
Like you actually do become deified ultimately if you do those two things, right?
But it's a non-inflationary.
Exactly. And that's the kind of the paradox of, it's the paradox of creation, and the paradox of the Garden of Eden, which is that if Adam had submitted to the will of God and not eaten of the fruit of the tree, then God would have given him the fruit of the tree. That's the tradition, right? That's what many saints have said. And not only that, but that would have been his access to the tree of life, which would have been perfect communion with the divine. And so it is in humility that we actually reach the highest.
It's interesting. I just read this morning when I was doing my Lectio Divina, Rilke's passage where he talks about we throw a ball into the infinite and then it returns to us differently. It returns to us heavier. And it's only in having done that we actually get to feel the true weight of things. And it sounds like you're saying something very analogous to that. So, but
how do we avoid the trauma? All I can say is the idea is obviously to place the trauma, ultimately to place it in Christ. Like the ultimate trauma, right, is communion. Like that's the ultimate trauma. If you really take communion seriously, you are engaging in a traumatic experience. You are eating the flesh and blood of the God-man. Like you are at the foot of horror. Like you talk about horror a lot in your lectures. And one of the things I do want to bring up to you is that is why communion, one of the aspects of communion is to bring you into that horror. Mm-hmm. In a manner which will save you and not destroy you, right? In a manner in which you can integrate it in that it's both a participation in horror and a communion of love at the same time in a paradoxical way.
Yeah. I mean, well, maybe we can talk about this at some point. I mean, I do think the sacred brings in simultaneously the symbolon, right? The horrifying function and the homing function in a profound way. And that goes back to, so, I mean, there's two things I want to say. One is, I'm trying to get, but there's a notion of mortality, and isn't it in the symbolism of carrying your cross that's analogous to the Buddhist notion that mortality isn't just death, but that the idea that moment by moment I'm dying. There's little deaths all the time, and that if I try to avoid that, if I try to get some kind of permanent hold on things, I'm gonna cut myself on that, and then I'm gonna cut other people. It's again, is that a correct analogy to you?
Yeah, of course. Yeah. Like if you look at the prayer of Jesus, the basic mystical prayer of the church, it has two parts, right? It has an invocation. It says, Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner. And so it's like there's this invocation and this remembrance of my own brokenness, remembrance of my own incapacity. And so those two movements simultaneously, they're the ones that will, and it's also, and because I think one of the problems of the trauma of the Protestant is, to a certain extent, the idea that, it's weird, like the idea that you should be pure, right? That you should be, but you can't. And so it's like, what do you do, right? You just remain in this strange, broken self. But if you rather see it as this necessary part of being a human person and moving towards the good, then it's not as traumatic, because you'll then see that even the saints lived in the most difficult temptations, that the saints were struggling with their passions, and those who reached the highest had the same frustrations you did. Like, no one pretends to be, there isn't like the person that's holier than thou, and that kind of just, if you read the lives of the saints, you see the story of broken people who their whole life struggle with thoughts and with temptations, and are delivered by God. But it's like, okay, if they struggled so for 30 years, you read crazy stories of the saints where it's like, for 40 years he struggled with the thought of fornication, and it's like, would he struggle with that for 40 years? Like, he actually struggled actively with that for 40 years? Okay, so I need to stop complaining, because seriously, there's no way that I'm doing that.
So Drew Hyland talks about this in connection with Plato and Socrates. He talks about it in terms of, he has a book called Finite Transcendence, where he said that Plato was always trying to keep this tension alive between the relationship to transcendence and the acceptance of our finitude, of our mortality. And so I'm wondering then if there is something like a feature of wisdom. I know you have your particular Christian commitments, and I'm not trying to trespass on those, but you're also you're not being offended, which I thank you for. When I make these connections to other things, you find them, I think, valuable, at least in discussion. But that there seems to be a feature of wisdom, which is this kind of tonos between, right, the aspiration in transcendence and then the deep acceptance of our humanity and our mortality, and keeping them always together is, and there's a finesse to that. There's a dynamic shifting. I can't give you a rule or a recipe for doing that. It's an ongoing, ever evolving capacity. Would you think that?
Yeah, it's a mode of being.
It's a
way of being, which is what will kind of hold those two things together. And I think your image of wisdom is particularly good, in the sense that wisdom, at least in scripture, at least in the Bible, the way that wisdom is described, seems to really be the capacity for let's say the principles or the ideals to be united with the particular. Like, that seems to be, it's like the wisdom always comes as like advice on how to find the good woman, or how to live your life, how to deal with money. Like, that's how wisdom comes, but it's patterning something which is above.
Yeah, Aristotle has that with Sophia and Phronesis being brought together, right? Sophia is your grasping of these universal and profound principles, and then Phronesis is how do you make them contextually relevant in a contextually sensitive manner. Mm-hmm. So this now brings me back around then. It sounds like this deeper reflection on, well, let's use the word sin for now. This deeper reflection on sin, affords us what might be missing in what we're seeing in the demonstrations. And this is part of my concern, that you talk about the inclusion as the sole value. I talk about something similar in that that justice is the sole virtue, and a very truncated sense of justice. The Greek sense of justice was always simultaneously external with others and internal with oneself. That's really clear. And what we have is we get a reduction of all the virtues to justice, and then just the social aspect of justice, hence the name, social justice.
Yeah, right? And we're not sure exactly what that justice entails in terms of its particular, like how it's going to manifest.
Well, and that goes to the point I want to make, because I have a concern that we are losing the other virtues. I mean, the Greeks had at least the cardinal four, and then the Christians add the sacred three, and so we at least have seven we should be talking about, right? We at least have seven we should be talking about, and we were just talking about one of the ones that's considered something like a meta virtue, which is wisdom. I shared what I think one interpretation of Socrates, that Socrates saw that each virtue was a way of being wise in a particular situation. The virtues aren't separate things,
yeah, of course,
particular ways of enacting. And so to me, if that argument is good, and I think it's a good argument, talking about justice without having a concern for wisdom seems to me to be like really, really almost oxymoronic. It seems to be self-contradictory, self-undermining. And that's a very dangerous kind of thing for human beings to be embracing. Committing yourself deeply to something that is self-undermining in its foundations is a very problematic thing to do. What do you think about that as a proposal?
No, I totally agree. And that's why it's one of the reasons, because the idea of justice, it seems to have something to do with equality. Although it's ill-defined as well. Like, what exactly do we mean by equality, and because obviously equality is a strange term, because you need a category to declare equality, because you can't have equality in everything, because then everything would just be the same. Like so equality is a complicated term. And so it seems like, it's like the intersectional, it's like the diversity, equity, inclusion, right? Those are the three kind of values that kind of mesh together in this idea of justice. And so the difficulty is, of course, that the revolutionary aspect of it is what you also talk about, in the sense of it undermining itself. It ends up eating itself, and it ends up eating itself by its very mechanism, which is that, I hate to say it this way, but it's inevitable to come to the fact that there is no such thing as equality, right? In terms of total equality. Right? Because what does it mean? Like, everybody's smarter or stupider than others. Some are taller, some are shorter. And it's individually true, and it's true in different categories and different cities, and it's like there's difference. You can't have equality, and so this like weird desire for equality ends up being a kind of power play. It seems not really a desire for equality, but a desire for power.
So I wonder if there's something going on here, a kind of displacement. Because, and this is going to be really, we have to move very carefully here. So I think what people want to do, sorry, that sounds pompous, but
it's hard to talk.
It seems plausible to me to propose that what people want to do is reduce the suffering of pain and distress, and then they're making a claim that most suffering or distress, or maybe all, right, is caused by inequality. And of course, there is truth to that. That when resources are not being distributed as fairly as they can, and fairness is not the same thing as equality. This is part of the problem, right? Because justice is also supposed to be about fairness, not just about equality. And so when we cause unnecessary suffering. So let me try and give you a bit of a slight riff on this. I see the left as really sensitive to the fact that human beings are, I'll use a Greek term here, but you'll find a Christian analog, I'm sure. That human beings are really subject to fate. That there is just shitty things that happen to human beings because they're finite and they're limited, and the world is an overwhelming machine, and there's historical forces and material forces, you might even say powers and principalities at work, right? And people are just subject, right? And that we have to do, and that people therefore deserve our aid even if they haven't earned it. Because if we don't do that, we are, and this is like the aspect of sin again, we're ignoring the fact that we are finite and we are subject to forces beyond our control. The left gets that, and I think the right tends to forget that, and that's why the right often comes off as cruel. But what the left forgets is what the right is no matter how, how haphazardly they do it and stupidly they do it, is the right choice to remind people that even though we are subject to fate and people should be aided beyond what they deserve or have earned, right? Human beings are nevertheless also responsible. They need to cultivate virtue, because every human being is beset by self-deception. And the only person that can get out of self-deception, I can't get you out of your own self-deception. I can give you guides, but you have to go through it. Like, you have to go through it. I can't do that for you, right? So to put it in a slogan, the left remembers fate and forgets virtue, and the right remembers virtue and forgets fate. And so what I'm trying to get at is how could we change this discussion about justice so that we could put it back into what it was supposed to be paired with, which was sophronism, right? We pursue the external justice of trying to reduce the suffering of others that are caused by history and fate, has to always be counterbalanced by sophronism, the cultivation of the inner justice, of virtue. And that those, for the Greeks, it was axiomatic that you had to talk about those two things together. Somehow we have gotten to the point where we only talk about one side of this. And I find that also a very lopsided thing. Sorry, that was a long thing to say, but you're a deep thinker, and I want to give you a lot to wrestle with.
Yeah. Well, it seems like the way that, at least when I look at the way that things happen in the Bible, and kind of the way the emphasis that Christianity has put on it, is obviously Christianity is obviously very, very preoccupied with the poor in the broadest way you can interpret that, and those that have less, and those that have little.
Exactly.
Right? Whether it's the poor in terms of their own, let's say, spiritual poor, or it's poor even physically in terms of their material poor, or it's the sick, or it's those that have no recourse, like the widow and the orphan. This is something that Christianity is extremely concerned about. But the way that Christianity seems to have concerned itself about it mostly is to ask those who have to give, right? To put responsibility on those who have to care for those who need to be cared for.
Sure.
Rather than tell those who are lacking to go get theirs, right?
Yeah.
To take it from those who have it. And that's really the difference between the revolutionary mindset and the Christian mindset. And some people might say, well, why can't it happen? Like, why can't those that have less just take it back? And the reason is a very practical reason. It's because it's a self-defeating pattern.
Yes.
A pattern which will destroy itself, because there's always someone who has less than you, and there's always someone who will be there to take from you, even though you think you're the one who has less, and so you take from that one above you. But then there's always someone below you who has less than you and will take from you. And as soon as you take from that one above you, the power especially, then you become the one who is now in the, who's going to be shot. Like the story of Robespierre is obviously the most classic example of that happening. And so that seems to be the way that Christianity deals with it. And there are consequences if you don't. And the consequences need to be kind of put in the right position. The way I kind of say it is, I don't excuse the peasants for killing the king, right? But I still think it's partly the king's fault, right? It's still because the king didn't care for the peasants that the peasants ended up killing him. And I'm not justifying the peasants' actions, but I am saying that if you don't care for the poor, at some point, it's going to happen. Like the people will come and take theirs if you don't care for them. But it's not morally justified that they do. I don't know if that makes sense.
No, it does. I get what you're saying, but what I was trying to, well, maybe this is a way of bringing it back.
Yeah.
Like I'm trying to get to this notion that it isn't just about equality or even equity. I'm trying, you're right. Both, you see Jesus and the Buddha, both. And what's interesting is they both do this. They both criticize equally something like cruelty and something like hypocrisy, right? And so what I'm saying is what we're trying to bring in here as we're trying to encompass the nature of human beings is that the notion of social justice, especially if it becomes just the pursuit of equality, does not have the machinery to deal with it. I mean, Jesus and the Buddha are neither left nor right. Like, it doesn't make sense to talk.
No.
They're right. Yeah, exactly. But
It doesn't make sense at all.
Exactly. Right. And so the point is, in a very profound way, it's not that they're non-political, but they're, if you'll allow me, they're meta-political.
Oh yeah.
Right. They're trying to get at what are the values or the virtues people should be aspiring to that are the most responsible, and I mean both senses of the word responsible, to human nature, right? That's what I see them doing, and that's what I'm not seeing in this movement. I'm not seeing the wisdom of, like we said, of trying to balance these things together, of getting a deep understanding of human nature. I'm hearing a very, very superficial theory about human nature and human history and human culture, and I don't think that the version of justice is what really concerns me. Is this version of justice? It sounds so easy, and that to me means it's got to be wrong, because I mean, what I get from all the great philosophers is justice, real justice. I mean, John Rawls writes this huge book, right? Like, real justice is hard. It's really hard because human beings are so incredibly complex, and they have, as we've been talking about here, these opposing forces and poles at work in them. That was a point I was trying to make. Sorry.
You're totally right. And I think that, like, if you look at how Christ deals with it, it's interesting because, we talked about responsibility, and you can see the way that Christ talks about it. Like, he talks to the Pharisees and he says, you're a bunch of hypocrites. And he talks to, woe to the rich if you don't care for the poor, and woe to, and blessed are those who are poor, for they will receive, and all of this. Like, there's all this in this, but he also has several parables where he talks about the poor who don't care for what they have and the consequences of that. Like, yes. He also has that. He also has the parable of the talents, where he talks about the servant who receives something and doesn't make it fruitful, and therefore has to face the consequences of not making fruitful that which he has. And so Christ talks at all levels at the same time. I always say, like you said, he's meta-political. He's a judge and a victim. He's the king and the servant. He's all these things at the same time, in a very paradoxical way. And so he kind of transcends politics. And it's interesting to watch politicians, the politically minded, because they see in Christ a kind of weird mirror of themselves. So the people on the left see Christ as a kind of revolutionary figure, and the people on the right see Christ as a get your act together type figure. And it's well, you know what? He's neither of those, really.
Yeah, I think that was very well said, Jonathan.
Yeah.
So
what to do with this? What to do with this weird? I think the way to understand it, and you talked a little bit before our conversation started about the inevitability of religio, and I think that's really the way to understand.
That's exactly where I wanted to go.
Yeah.
That this whole discussion seems to be pointing, right? It's making a very, I think, plausible argument about the inevitability of religio, the unavoidability of religio in human endeavor, and human existence. And you made this point, and I wanted to give you the opportunity to expand on it. You made a point of criticizing the new atheists, in how they were sort of saying, if we could just get rid of religion, and what they did is, they identified religion with a belief in the supernatural, et cetera, and if we just got rid of those false beliefs, then that would be it. And then your point is, well, the people that are in these marches, they're not advocating anything necessarily supernatural, something perhaps transcendent, but not supernatural, et cetera. They're not doing all, but nevertheless, look at the religious behavior. Look at how comprehensive and powerful it is, and look at how much it's a response to the way the COVID crisis accelerated the meaning crisis. You made that, and it was sort of a very brief thing. It was about 2 or 3 minutes in the video, but I wanted to give you, and I think this is a good context, you and I in discussion, I wanted to give you the opportunity to expand on that.
Yeah. Well, my criticism of the new atheists, and I would use Steven Pinker as the main example, just because of the kinds of books he's written and the kind of statements he's made about enlightenment and this kind of progress and everything, is that, and I think that what you're doing is a much better, like the cog-sci approach and the cognitive science approach is a much better approach to this, because there is an understanding of what a human being is in a deeper way.
Yes.
And there's an understanding of the reasons why we have certain patterns and the reason why certain things exist within us. And what the New Atheists seem to want to do is to see the advantage of reason and then want to kind of box the human being in reason and see everything which is outside of reason as the thing to get rid of, as the bad thing to get rid of. There's our original sin, is everything that's outside of reason needs to be eliminated. But the problem is that you can't eliminate it, you know, and there's a kind of weird utopian vision. And the example I always use is the example of sleep. You could say, and reason and awakeness, you know, and the idea of kind of this other aspect of us in sleep, it's a good way to understand it. It's as if I told you, you could be way more productive if you didn't sleep. Like, you just have to not sleep, and then you could be awake all the time. And wouldn't that be amazing? Like, then you would imagine how much progress you would make. Like, imagine how far you would go if you would just stay awake all the time. But the reality is that you can't. That's not part of being a human being. And so these other patterns that we have are there. And they're extremely important. And if you try to get rid of them, what they do is they go down for a little while, and then they come back like a monster, and then will swallow you. And that's those are the kinds of things we saw in the French Revolution, in the Russian Revolution, all the kind of end of atheist cycle where all of a sudden the patterns come back like a big monster to devour you. And now we're seeing very similar things as well. We're seeing a secular religious manifestation, and it's akin to the one we saw in the French Revolution, and it's akin to the one we saw in the Russian Revolution. And so, and I always want to say, it's like the people who kind of made fun of Jordan Peterson talking about this, it's like, it's happening right now. It's happening right now. Look at what's going on. And you can just poo-poo it. You can toss it to the side, but it's the same pattern happening again. And the reason for the pattern is the same. Like, the denial of, sorry, I get excited and I throw myself.
Me too.
The denial of certain aspects of the human person is going to come back. Yeah. And so the idea is, what do you do? Like, how do you deal with it? And to me, that's why I think that having a conscious religious aspect to you, that's why ritual, conscious ritual is important, because ritual will be there. You can't avoid it. Now, the question is whether or not it's part of you integrated, or whether or not you're a slave to ritualized behavior and kind of scapegoat and identity forming behavior that is just part of existence.
I think that was very beautifully said. Yeah, I agree. I think the first point you made about the cog-sci and all the stuff on relevance realization and those aspects that are pre-rational and how primordial they are, and the importance of ritual. So for those of you, I mean, you're watching this video, you know this work, and so there's arguments there, and thank you, Jonathan, for gesturing to them. And then as you were building on that, I thought of this scene, and you'll probably be able to riff on this because it's from mythology, it's from a science fiction classic, Journey to the Center of the Earth. And especially in the movie version, Count Saknussemm, who's the villain, you'll see how this connects in just a sec. They come to him and they say, well, don't you sleep? And he said, I never sleep. I hate those little slices of death. And he represents right. So the journey to the center of the earth, which of course has all kinds of mythic, meanings attached to that, right? But he's the villain, and notice how he brings together like your analogy and how it connects back to an unwillingness to accept his humanness, his mortality. There's the hubris in here, and that cycles us back again to this refusal to accept our humanity. It's again the same kind of. It's a puritanical kind of refusal to accept our humanity in a profound hubristic way, and that I think is what, when I've talked to people who have sort of come out of the new atheist movement, one of the things that they'll often say that started putting them off was they got a sense of arrogance attached to these people. And I'm not talking about, and part of it is no doubt personality. There's narcissism and stuff that, but I think they might also have been putting out their finger on this sense that, right, there are aspects of our humanity that are not being given due. And this is what I mean again about justice, Sophros justice. Plato had this sense that you had to give all of the parts of the human their due. They had to be given their due regard, their due role, their due place. The attempt to eradicate it was a deep mistake, right? Right? And so the Sophros and the inner justice is we have to give due regard and due place and due role for all aspects of our humanity.
If you look at the very first commandment, or the very first place in Scripture where it talks about something which is holy, is in the description of creation. And so you have 6 days, then you have the 7th day, which is the day of rest, and it's the day which is set aside for God, right? It's the holy day. And right there in Genesis, it says that's why we follow the Sabbath. Now, that there's a mystery in that which is very profound. And the mystery is that it's exactly the mystery that the new atheists are incapable of seeing, which is that the way that the world is made and the way that consciousness is made and the way that reason is made is because it's a patterning system. It can never encompass everything, right? It can be coherent, but it cannot be complete.
Yeah.
And you need to leave a bit out for completeness to manifest itself, like in its mystery. So you need to leave a bit on the edge that is not closed, that isn't tied up, that isn't accounted for. There has to be some aspects which are not accounted for. Right. If you try to account for everything, that's the most dangerous thing, right? It's the
Yeah.
And if you also try to see that which is accounted for as totality, which is the sin of Satan, which is the sin of pride, which is the sin of Adam, that's the hubris. Yes. And then you fall, because that aspect which is supposed to be unaccounted for, which you're trying to ignore, is still there, right? And the fascinating aspect of that margin, or the let's say the 7th day, is that it has 2 parts to it. It has a part which is the unfathomable of creation, right? The completeness of creation, but it also points to the infinite. Yeah. There's a secrecy in it which also points to the infinite, which is why it's both the day of rest, but also the day set aside for God at the same time. So it's both death and the source of life at the same time.
That's very interesting. Your invocation of Gödel, I mean, I take Gödel's theorem that you can't have it both complete and consistent to be an example of what I meant earlier by mortality. That's the mortality in the heart of any epistemological project. Or, Heisenberg's uncertainty, that's the mortality in the heart of any empirical observation or investigation, and more of these, right? And the history of philosophy of the last 2 centuries have been, philosophy and science, at least the more philosophical aspects of science, have been the discovery of this. I like your invocation of it, because it brings me back around, and I don't know if you're doing it deliberately or not, but you're invoking. I heard Levinas when you were comparing totality to infinity, because he has a book around that, right? And how infinity is not the same thing as totality, because totality is the pretense that you have both consistency and completeness. That's my way of understanding it. And therefore, if you take the Gödel's argument seriously, and you should, right, that is always a dangerous pretense. And that the problem with any system that claims to be complete and consistent is that it is actually a deep form of self-deception.
Oh yeah, so, that's for sure.
So I mean, and this is what, this is the great, for all of the criticisms I have of them, this is the great thing that comes out of the whole pragmatism movement of James and Peirce and Dewey and more recent people, like Quine and Davidson. And they've had a deep influence on me. I haven't had a chance to talk about them very much. I will in another series. But the point I'm trying to get to here is, like, there's a shadow side of totalitarianism. There's a negative version of it, which is strategies of eradication. Because eradication is an attempt to be completely consistent and complete. So there's an argument, and I'm not advocating for all of his ideas, but I just want to give due credit. Coleman Hughes makes this argument about, look, we all agree that murder is a deeply immoral act. And I'm not playing around with terms. Well, sometimes you kill, but when we say killing that's not immoral, we don't call it murder. Murder is the name for the killing we regard as immoral. So let's not play that game. So we regard murder as immoral, but we don't pursue an eradication strategy in our society. Because if we were to try to eradicate murder, we would so subject ourselves to a radically dehumanizing totalitarian state and that's why no culture anyway does it, right? Every culture has prohibitions against murder. There's variations on it, of course, but you don't see them saying, and what we're going to do is we're going to set things up so that murder is impossible. That's a Philip K. Dick kind of situation.
Oh, yeah. It's a scary thing. No, and you're right about the strategies of eradication. These are extremely frightening because they tend towards exactly what you're talking about. And I'm afraid that I see the same, and I'm afraid that I'm seeing that right now with COVID. I'm seeing exactly a falling into a strategy of eradication where we think that we cannot continue to live until this virus ceases to exist.
Yes.
This is not how it works. This is a dangerous, because the method you will use to eradicate the virus, the totalitarian method you will use, will be extremely harmful. They will be very, very harmful to our health, to our community, all of these things. And it's like the difficulty that you understand the desire to eradicate, because it's a bad thing, right? This virus is a bad thing. You want it to go away. But once you enter into that strategy of eradication, especially with techno-states where you are develop the power to push that capacity of eradication to its, to limits that were not seen before, it's a very, very frightening situation.
Yeah. A clear example of that is the proposal that we start tracking everybody's movement, every movement. I say, people, do you really want the state to have that power? Do you really want the state to have that power? Do you really want the corporations to have that power? They already have that power to some degree, and they use it to manipulate you. I can't believe it. I saw a BBC article just a few days ago, and it was just like a regular article where they're talking about what the future of travel will look like. And in their description of the future of travel, they talked about vaccines with identification in the vaccine, that they can scan your body so that you, and this was a BBC article. It wasn't a conspiracy article. It wasn't like it was like, this is what travel is going to look like. They'll scan your body to know whether or not you have the vaccine, and they'll let you participate in social things depending on whether or not they can track you. It's like, my goodness. Don't you watch science fiction movies? I don't know. Like, am I the only one who watches science fiction movies? Well, I watch them too. So, I mean, and we have to be careful here. So, COVID is very bad.
Oh, yeah.
No. I want to make an analogy here. COVID is very bad, and we should try as much as we can ameliorate it, but with wisdom, toggling against over-empowering the state and taking a dehumanized view or a simplistic view of human nature in order to achieve it. So we don't push for eradication. We push for amelioration that doesn't cost us too much our humanity. Isn't that the same attitude we should take for how to deal with the very real evil of racism? That we should try, and we should continue to try to ameliorate it. But we shouldn't, I talk a lot about how you frame the problem is way more important than the method about actually solving it. Should we be adopting a mindset that is a totalitarian kind of eradication, about something like racism. It strikes me that argument by analogy means there is a sense in which we can go too far on this. And that doesn't, I hope, that doesn't make me a racist. And what I've seen is I saw the interview with Don Lemon, and I forget the name of the actor, and he was trying to say, he's a black guy. And he's trying to say, I'm just saying that some of the leaders of the movement are going too far, too extreme. That's all he was proposing. And he was treated with smugness and dismissed. And then this horrible argument by Lemon, well, people accuse Martin Luther King of being too extreme, as if, well, are you saying that because sometimes people have misused that word, that every time they use it, they're misusing it? That's a really stupid argument. Can we have a better argument, please? And it's like, if we can't even bring up the question that we might be framing the attempt to achieve a goal, a laudable goal that I fully support, then I think we're in a very, very bad place. I think we're getting into a very bad place.
Yeah, and you're right, because one of the things COVID did was awaken in us this pattern of infection, right?
Yes, yeah.
And it awakened in us the pattern of infection and the desire to exclude and eradicate.
Yeah.
And now it's being politicized, like not the COVID, like it's weird because you can see that there's no narrative connection between COVID and Floyd, but there is a pattern connection.
Yeah,
and you can see that that it's awakened the pattern, and now it's playing out in the political sphere.
Well, I mean, isn't that a case? Again, I'm talking at the latent level, not the manifest level, but that seems like a case. It's like a clear case of what a psychodynamic person would call displacement, right? That you're being, it's like COVID puts you like you're suddenly in the Old Testament, and I don't mean that pejoratively, right? Like, you have this ubiquitous threatening things out there in the world, and you have to adopt this very insular purity code, and then you don't know when it's going to strike you, and then right, and they might be infected, but now what we can do is we couldn't do anything about the COVID, but I think what your suggestion is, but I can do something about this over here.
Can do something about, yeah. And the danger of the racist thing is the limit of it, because the problem with racism is that it's this invisible thing in the sense that it ends up being thoughts and feelings in people.
Yes.
And the idea that you can reprogram someone and that you can move towards the eradication of thoughts and feelings. I mean, we know where that leads. Like, we know where that goes. And because it can't happen, then like I said before, what it's going to end up looking like is scapegoating, where we're going to we're going to find examples that we can drag out in public and, have watch struggle sessions and have them be humiliated in public so that we can deal with the problem of eradicating something which is unconscious bias. Like, it's unconscious. So how can you eradicate it?
Well, I think trying to eradicate that is, given what we've argued, isn't that the same? It's ultimately committing you at some level to eradicating the machinery of humanity.
That's right.
Right. And so
let's say that I've been more and more attracted to René Girard in the past year, I would say, just because of everything that's happened. And I've been seeing that his analysis of the situation is really one of the wisest in terms of the way that he interpreted what's happening and intersectionality. I mean, he passed away, I think, around 2010 or maybe a bit later. He talked about, I saw a quote of his in 2007 where he talked about the machine of Antichrist, which is ramping up, and he saw exactly what we're seeing. He said it'll be infinite victimhood looking for infinite scapegoat. And so it's like this perpetual wheel of victimhood, which is looking perpetually for more and more scapegoats, like almost like a self-devouring machine. And so we're seeing it. The solution is, like, I know you dislike when I push it too far, but the solution is the image of the scapegoat being the murderer and the victim at the same time, right? Identifying with Christ and identifying with those that killed him, identifying with the capacity to exclude and the reality of also being excluded to a certain extent. Like those two things together, if you can integrate them properly and not in a weird disorderly manner, can help you have compassion for those who are excluded, but can help you also understand that you are one of those who do that all the time.
Yes.
That you're always doing it.
But this is what I meant. I think there's power in Girard's argument. I've only read the one book, and I'm not completely. At the one I saw, Satan Fall Like Lightning.
Yeah.
But the idea that you can explode if you'll allow me to use some of my terms, you can explode the cultural cognitive grammar of scapegoating, and that the Christian mythos does that. I thought that was one of the most powerful arguments, and it's a new argument, as far as I know, one of the most powerful apologetic arguments for Christianity that I had heard in quite some time. So I think that is a good point that you brought up. But it does. I think it's situated within this larger task again, which we keep coming back to, of trying to get to a place where we can simultaneously accept faith and virtue. Because one of the ways in which you can, right? One of the ways in which you can address people's thoughts and feelings is by inspiring them to aspire to virtue, rather than trying to eradicate. You can try to inspire the aspiration to virtue. And this has been, to my mind, a very, very successful strategy. Where I've been talking a lot recently, and Akira the Dawn did the meaning wave about it, about stealing the culture. And I actually use Christianity as a primary example of that. That Christianity doesn't try and overthrow the political structure. What it does is it steals the culture. It creates an entirely different culture from the bottom up. And then, because the problem, to my mind, what the French Revolution shows is you can radically transform the state, but if you don't transform the underlying cultural cognitive grammar and normativity, nothing is fundamentally going to change.
Yeah, you just change the ones who are holding the reins, and
you circulate the elites.
Exactly.
Right. And so, whereas what Christianity does is it builds a new civilization. Buddhism does the same thing, right? It builds a new civilization. Islam does the same thing. It builds a new civilization. And so that brings us, and we don't have much time, I suppose, but so that brings me towards the third point, which you said you sort of despair of knowing what to do. And I'm wondering if you, sorry, I realized I might be daring the preposterous thing of proposing some sort of a Christian thing to a Christian, which is a ridiculous thing. But I gave you all of those examples, and to my mind, of the idea of, well, isn't the response to do as much as we can to engage in building the next culture? And that sounds preposterous, but a commitment to that kind of thing seems to me to be the most responsible response to the depth of the situation we are in right now.
Yeah. No, I think so. I mean, I would say on a personal level, love God, love your neighbor is a pretty good thing to live by in the immediate reality, and not abstract categories. To deal, to love the people that you encounter with, to see in them the face of God, is something that will transform at least your life. It's harder in terms of a social responsibility. For sure, myself, the way that I frame it, that's why I'm doing what I'm doing. What you said is that I'm trying to help people see the grammar of culture, or see the pattern.
Exactly.
And of course, one of the things I've been emphasizing the most is the importance of the margin, and talking about the margin in a balanced way, so that you neither have the desire to, because both sides want to eliminate the margin. Everybody wants to eliminate it. They want to eliminate the margin either by making it the same as the center, by integrating all the marginal aspects and making them equal to everything else, or by eradication, or by cutting it off. And that's the real problem with it's the question we had during the first wave of violence of the 20th century. You had two sides. You had one side which wanted to create an equal utopia, and one which wanted to create a hierarchical utopia that cut off the margin, that burned it off. Yeah. And we're facing the same, it's like we didn't deal with it. We're facing the same problem now. And we're seeing the one side now. We're seeing the side that wants everything to be equal. But I always tell people that when the Nazis came to Germany, they were on the verge of a communist revolution. It's not the pendulum doesn't move in one direction.
No,
the pendulum swings, and it's a scary thing to watch.
Well, but this is part of the way in which, again, the way in which this lack of a dynamical nuance in thinking. So, you know, Leo Ferraro and I talk about this idea that you in living systems, and right, you see opponent processing, and I've argued, right, and that what an opponent processing means, this is the way you deal with trade-offs. And we've been talking about trade-offs all the way through, right? You have opponent processing, like your parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system. Like the sympathetic nervous system is biased. It tries to interpret everything as a threat or an opportunity, and it arouses you. And the parasympathetic system is biased, and it tries to interpret everything as a signal that you should relax and calm down. And their biases work in opposite direction, but they're functionally integrated together, because that's how you get the most self-corrective system. Mm-hmm. And what we're supposed to have, and you can see this in Dewey, right, is we're supposed to have opponent processing, but what it's devolved into is adversarial processing.
Yeah.
Right? And this is the eradication idea. It's a zero-sum game. I've given up the idea of self-correction. I've given up the idea of commitment to a process that you and I, even though we disagree, we can commit to, like you and I do in dialogue. We have disagreements, but we see the potential that we can correct each other in valuable ways that we mutually appreciate, right? There was that commitment, and that commitment to that process has been lost. Like the fact that most Americans are more distrusting of the opposite party than they are of foreign threat. Like, what the heck does that mean, right? What does that mean to you? And so the adversarial, eradicate the other, destroy the other, zero-sum game mentality, I think has made the process, I think, is broken. Yeah. I think the process is broken. And so I don't know, I don't see how, I mean, and Layman Pascal and others, they disagree with me on this. I don't know how to work within that in a way. And so that's what I mean by steal the culture, that I don't know if working within that machinery is a viable strategy. I think the strategy has to be, Jonathan, I was at a conference 2 weeks ago called the Movement Summit, and there's all these communities of practice springing up everywhere, or trying to integrate mindfulness and movement practices and discourse practices, and so many of them. And and these people, and they all want to talk to each other, and they want to network, and it felt very different. It was neither the revolution of the left or the law and order of the right. It was orthogonal to that. It was these people trying to seriously, time and talent and money and energy and commitment to the cultivation of wisdom in a deeply alternative way of being. And to my mind, that's where, and I know you think it should be given a particular Christian slant, but I also think you're charitable enough to include other people of good faith who are willing to work with you. I think that's where the answer to the more difficult problem lies. I think there is stuff actually happening right here, right now, culturally, symbolically, existentially, that is where the difference that is needed is starting to be generated.
Oh, but I for sure agree. I think that the seeds of like a way to see it is like that. This is horrible because it has bad implications, but the seeds of the next world will appear in the current one, right?
Yes.
Like they're just hard to see. The little sprouts are hard to see because everything else is burning in the forest, right? So it's difficult to see the seeds as this is kind of breaking apart. And I mean, I'm curious to see how all of this will be integrated. I do again, like, we've talked about this before, right? So we're not going to come to a conclusion, but I do think that there is a need for a narrative cohesion. And I do think that until something happens in the West, it's still the Christian narrative. So I don't see a way out of it for at least, I don't see a way out of it. So,
Sure.
but I do think that the questions that people are asking, and that the desire for wisdom and the desire for transformation is one which will bear fruit. It has to, if it's done with sincerity and done, in a desire for transformation, it will bear fruit.
Yeah, and the point I'm trying to make is, thank you for saying that. And from my part, I don't ever claim to have a foreclosure argument against Christianity. I always say that I do not have such a thing. But what I was trying to emphasize is there's not only sincerity, there's depth in like what's going on here. It has the appreciation for humanity and complexity. That's what I'm seeing in these people in this movement. Of course, we're all flawed human beings. I'm not painting some utopic vision, but I'm talking about, a real possibility and the acknowledgement that I think it's in existence. I like your metaphor for all the ways it's fraught, but I do like your metaphor of the seeds. I do like putting the two together, that the burning of the forest actually fertilizes the seeds in the way they need to be fertilized. And perhaps you were alluding to that. And your wry smile.
Yeah, but it's not fun. It's not fun.
No,
it's not pleasurable.
No, it means death and suffering.
Yep.
And I have kids, and I don't want this. But I want and what needs to happen are not always the same thing.
Yeah.
Jonathan, I think maybe this would be a good place to bring it to a close. So I proposed to you privately, and you already agreed, so I'm going to do it publicly. I think that you and I and Paul should have a discussion like this, a dialogos, as I would call it, at length for the three of us. And I'd like to invite you, and then I've also invited Paul, and let's try and work to make it happen, because I think it would be very beneficial for all of our respective listeners.
Yeah, that would be great. I would love that. Yeah, let's set it up.
Okay, so I'll reach out to Paul, and I'll try and make it happen. So I found. Well, you could see I got passionate, which means this was definitely dialogos for me. I always say that the difference between a dialogos and a monologue is both people find themselves educed. They find themselves drawn to a place they couldn't get to individually on their own. And there's a kind of education in that that's very different from just sort of thinking in your own head.
Yeah.
And so I always find that the case when I get into such a dialogue with you. And I wanted to thank you for it. You had so many insightful and brilliant ways by which so many insights and brilliant things you said, and not only what you said, the manner in which you said, the imagery that you used was itself often deeply helpful. So thank you very much. Thank you very, very much.
Well, I always enjoy talking to you, and I really appreciate the insight you're bringing to the conversation, and I'm looking forward to seeing where this is going, and kind of how this is slowly going to let's say dance together is the best way to say it. So
yeah, I agree. Okay, so thank you very much.
All right, John, it was good to talk to you.
Good to talk to you.
All right, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.